Hey, my name is Ryan, and I'm going to be talking about dual relationships today and how to solve them ethically in your counseling practice. So, as the name suggests, dual relationships in counseling occur when a person holds more than one role in a relationship. So, this could be like a supervisor who's also your friend. They're pretty common across different cultures and professions, and in counseling, this might exist between a supervisor and supervisee, as I just mentioned, but it can also exist between counselor and client. So basically, dual relationships have both a professional and a secondary relationship. And the secondary relationship might be social, financial, familial. They also might be intentional or accidental. So sometimes counselors might find that they stumble into these dual relationships without intending to. And they can also occur during or after supervision or counseling. And it's important to note that dual relationships might help the counseling process, but they could certainly harm it as well. So the study that I decided to look into that inspired me to look further into dual relationships was a survey that was launched in 1999. It was a while back, but I find that it's still relevant. So it was conducted in the state licensing boards of 34 jurisdictions, and it involves credentialed counselors, which is defined as counselors who are not just licensed, but also registered and certified. And the study itself was called Ethical Complaints Made Against Credentialed Counselors, an updated survey of state licensing boards. And basically, there were 1,018 complaints identified. 246 of those, so about a quarter of those, were for inappropriate dual relationships. So it's obviously quite prominent in our profession, and it's something to be on the lookout for. Of all the complaints, only 10% were formally investigated. Just something to keep in mind. You might see that big figure and feel intimidated, but these aren't always investigated. And so to see how to explore dual relationships in a counseling practice, I used a case example here to show you how you might approach this as a counselor and how you might apply the ethical decision-making process. Let's say that you are a school counselor and you're at home smoking weed with an 18-year-old high school student, and this student is a client or a student at the school that you're currently working at. And then after this, you decide to drive to buy alcohol. You were then arrested for a DUI and plead no contest. The incident appears in your local newspaper, and photos of you as the counselor using substances are posted on the student's social media. This is a pretty extreme case, but what would you do in this situation? How would you apply the ethical decision-making model? So before we get into that, I wanted to touch on the ethical code violations in the American Counseling Association. With this particular case, we see code A.1.A was violated since the counselor failed to protect the client's welfare by engaging in substance use. And while the client was old enough to at least consume marijuana, they were not old enough to drink in most jurisdictions. So basically, the counselor failed in this domain with this particular code, and it was exacerbated by the DUI. And code 8.4.A instructs counselors to avoid causing harm to clients. And this incident might have introduced emotional, legal, and developmental risks to the vulnerable client and student. And again, while the client was of age, still something that could potentially have harmed them. Next, 8.6.B, extending boundaries. So basically, when non-professional interactions arise, this can lead to blurred lines and impair our judgments. 8.5.D calls for avoiding becoming kind of too friendly with our clients. And in this prompt, I think I left it out in the original prompt, but basically the counselor described the student as their favorite, and that amplifies this situation here. And it's a clear, inappropriate dual relationship. Another ethical code violation was C.6.D, exploitation of others. So the client, given that their power in the relationship, might have influenced the client's risky behavior, and this might have led to violated trust and power boundaries. F.10.D is a code that focuses on non-academic relationships, and basically informal non-academic relationships with students pose potential harm and ethical breaches. Okay, so now that we've covered all the ACA codes that might be implicated in this case, how do you go about actually solving things? Basically, the first step is to identify the problem, next to apply the ACA Code of Ethics. Determine the nature and dimensions of the dilemma is the third step. Fourth step is to generate potential courses of action. The fifth is to consider the potential consequences of all options and determine a course of action. The sixth is to evaluate the selected course of action. And finally, to implement the course of action. So we've identified the problem basically in the prompt. It should be pretty clear, but the issue is that the counselor used marijuana and alcohol with an 18-year-old client. The counselor then drove under the influence, was arrested, and then finally the incident was made public. So as we discussed, these here are the ACA Code of Ethics that were violated, and it's worth mentioning that there were probably more ethical codes that were violated as well. So determining the nature and dimensions of the dilemma, basically there are 5 ethical principles: non-maleficence, fidelity, justice, autonomy, and beneficence. So the counselor broke these by causing harm, by breaking trust, by showing favoritism, by compromising the client's ability to consent. And basically what it boils down to is that the counselor didn't act in the client's best interest. Here are some potential courses of action. The counselor has the option to self-report to the licensing board and supervisor. The counselor might refer the client to another counselor. The counselor could consider a leave of absence and substance use evaluation. The counselor might seek legal advice, ethics training, and personal therapy. Finally, the counselor might issue a statement of accountability if appropriate. So basically, with this step in the ethical decision-making model, we're listing out all of the viable strategies that the counselor might take in cases of ethical violations or breaches. So after mapping out all the different courses of action, it's important to evaluate them and determine which route will be the best. And ultimately, I determined that the best course of action would be to end personal contact with the student in this situation, both outside of school and in school, transferring the client's care to another school counselor. Finally, I would also self-report and seek supervision. Next, I would take responsibility publicly if advised by legal counsel. And basically, I think that this multi-pronged approach upholds client safety, promotes accountability on the counselor's end. So evaluating that multi-pronged approach, I think that the actions are ethical, just, and transparent. They align with professional standards and pass the fairness, publicity, and universality tests, which makes them the most appropriate path forward. So basically, if you're ever thinking to yourself, oh, geez, is this the right course to take? You would evaluate using those 3 tests there: fairness, publicity, and universality. And that is all. Here are the references. Thanks.